You're listening to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. It's fast, fun, free, daily deep dive Bible, and right now we're working on the book of Nehemiah. If you're new, welcome. You can jump in right here, or you can always go back and start at the beginning of any season. The whole podcast is available in an easy-to-use format at thetmdh.com.
All right, we got a conundrum. In Nehemiah chapter 4, Nehemiah is praying against his enemies. It's a very bold, very aggressive prayer. We've been looking at it the last few days. In the first part of the prayer, he specifically says, "Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads." And we talked about how that's reflective of the language in the book of Esther from just a generation before Nehemiah. And Nehemiah's looking at this and he's like, hey, I've seen you do it before. I've seen you flip around people's evil and anger so it comes right back around and boomerangs on them. God, would you please do that here with the people who are opposing the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem? And then in the next part of the prayer, he says, give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. And yesterday we looked at some of the language about plunder and God judging the nations and what this kind of prayer means. I mean, Nehemiah taking things very, very seriously. And everybody who heard it would know, dang, whether you think he's praying to an actual God or not, he means that. And then in this final part of the same prayer, which is Nehemiah 4:5, Nehemiah prays the following. There's a conundrum here. We're going to get to the conundrum in just a second. Let me read this part. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. He understands where this fits in the grand redemptive plan. He understands how vital this is for the preservation of his people, a people who barely escaped annihilation just a generation earlier during the reign of the king whose son Nehemiah now serves. And the conundrum that this prayer poses for you and me is as follows. What does the Bible actually teach? Are you supposed to not judge, or are you supposed to judge? One of the most quoted, most referenced, most searched things in the whole Bible is Matthew 7:1. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Those are the words of Jesus. They don't just happen in the backwaters of some page that people kind of forget about. It's in the Sermon on the Mount. This is Jesus explaining the values of the kingdom in his inaugural address as he is announcing his kingdom. It's a really big deal. Now, the question begins to be answered in the very next phrase in Matthew chapter 7. The very next thing Jesus says is, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when the whole time there's a plank in your own eye? Okay, so we're getting more details about what judgment actually means here. It's not just this broad brush, don't see or observe anything, turn off all ability to critically think. If someone's getting murdered, you just have to think to yourself, well, that's not murder, or it's not mine to judge as to whether or not some murder should occur. It's not the teaching of Jesus here. Now, the very next passage indicates that at some point, at least, there is propriety after great self-reflection and receiving criticism and critique for yourself, or even from yourself, to look at your brother or sister, somebody you care about and are invested in, and to give difficult feedback to them, but not when you're blind and you can't see, because, you want to be able to get the thing right. Otherwise, you're going to jab people in their eyes, and then everybody's going to be blind, and it's going to be a nightmare. No, Jesus is doing the thing where he's encouraging shrewdness. He goes on, you hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you'll see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So 1, be self-aware and get your own stuff together. And then 2, shrewdly and carefully, with care and compassion, you could be in a position to help and serve your brother. Okay, well, I understand why people would fixate on the first half of this, because a lot of times when people get after you about things, there isn't a tremendous amount of effort put into understanding how you got there, why it went wrong, or if it's even actually wrong. He's critiquing religious people for not totally getting it, but you'll notice he is not telling them, abandon your ability to think critically or to observe things for how they are. Rather, he's saying, sharpen your ability to do those things so that when you decide it is shrewd or right or loving to exercise those skills, you will do so in a way that is useful for, as is explained later on in the New Testament, building people up for this being productive, an act of love and service, even to your enemies. All of that, I mean, we went all the way through Matthew. If you want to know more about it, you can go back and listen to all the Matthew stuff. It's all in there. We covered it in depth. I'm giving you the quick version. But then there's an even less quoted verse that comes next from Jesus here in Matthew 7:6 that further helps us get toward the answer of what does the Bible teach? You're supposed to judge, you're supposed to not judge. In verse 6, it says, "Don't give to dogs what is sacred. Don't throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and then turn and tear you to pieces." That one is super not Googled. Way not popular verse, but also a super important verse. Really, what it looks like Jesus is doing here is pushing back on two different ways a person could get it totally wrong and fail at life and in relationships and growth. One way would be to go around being a judgmental jerk who is both filled with self-loathing, but also kind of hates everybody else and only finds meaning in creating imaginary scorecards in your brain that only you know the rules to. And then you go around and just pick out all the things that other people do as they fail to live up to the rules that you completely arbitrarily invented and then didn't tell them about. It's a weird sickness. It's tempting to everybody to do it. Developing the ability to resist that impulse and only to use that kind of critical feedback in ways that are loving and born out of service and self-criticism, that's a hard thing to do, but that's the ideal. So mistake number one would be a great big judgy jerk. Jesus clearly is saying, don't be a great big judgy jerk. It's not good for you. It's not good for other people. But the mistake the other way would be so rubish and naive and stupid that you fail to evaluate anything or go through life without any shrewdness, with your eyes wide open, full of naivete. One of Jesus' favorite, most emphasized themes throughout all of his teaching is shrewdness. Read the room, read the situation, think about who you're talking to, think about what you're saying here. It's not that Jesus was some big relativist whose values changed depending on who he was talking to. No, not at all. He's absolutely steady. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. That's what the text says about him. But what he does suggest is that these values of the kingdom, which aren't as simple as commands, they're values, they require a degree of interpretation and application. They're supposed to inform the way you think and how you prioritize and how you do stuff. And so when you embrace these upside down values of the world and you take it out into a world that does not embrace your upside down Jesus kingdom values, well, it's going to be weird. It's going to be tricky. It's going to be hard to navigate, and probably no book could possibly be long enough to serve as a handbook for what you should do in every single situation with absolute specificity. Instead, there's a lot of trust on the part of Jesus here as he's explaining the kingdom. Like, well, you got to go out, you got to do things, and these values, they're going to set you up for success. Now, the pushback on that might be, well, what if I get things wrong? I mean, you're not telling me exactly what to do. I don't want you to hold my feet to the fire if I try and I didn't get it right because you didn't explain it clearly enough. Well, the great news here is that there's a gigantic grace safety net in how Jesus built the whole thing. It never was about the quality of your behavior. Your rightness with God never was about you getting every single decision perfectly right. Rather, your rightness with God is about the character and the work of Christ and what he did on the cross is the ultimate sacrifice for sin, and to buy back a people who were dead in their sin and to create out of them, like those stones coming back to life, a new family of faith, a new people where there was no people, life where there was death. So that allows Jesus to be really, frankly, pretty concise and to just deal mostly in principles when he talks about what he wants his followers to go out and do and how he wants them to live and advance the kingdom. It's a whole bunch of values. Then you got to go out and do those values. And then you got to cut other people slack who are really trying to get those values right as well, but might not come to the same shrewdness calculation that you do. And if they're wrong or you're both wrong, or you're wrong the next time and then they're right the next time and then it flips the next time, whatever, the grace of God is profound and infinite. And for the kingdom citizen, the person who's trying to internalize these values and live them out in a world that is hostile to these values, thank goodness, thank God, I dare even say, that there is this massive safety net of grace and mercy. It's very empowering for the agent of the kingdom, the follower of Christ, to go out and do stuff. So, back to our original question. Does the Bible then teach to judge or to not judge? And what exactly is it that Nehemiah is doing here in chapter 4? Well, I would submit to you that this prayer that, it feels pretty judgy in tone, But there's one key thing about this judgment, and it is that the judgment is ultimately outsourced to God. At its core, what you can see here is that Nehemiah has enthusiastically removed the speck from his own eye. Remember that stuff from his prayer in Nehemiah chapter 1? Picking it up in Nehemiah 1:6. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. He's aware there's just a bunch of junk in his eye and he's not really qualified. So it does seem that he's at least passing that basic test. But further, again, he's outsourcing the judgment to God. Implicit in any kind of prayer for justice or God's judgment, I mean, that's a risky prayer, is the idea that you're giving it over to God. God will be the decider. Nehemiah is not going to be the decider. And it's interesting because he could be here. He could just call in the might of the Persian Empire. He's got a pretty powerful friend. But he's more interested in building something than crushing these people. It seems like he wants to brush them aside, let God deal with whatever the heck that chatter is over there, and we're going to build this thing and move it forward. So I ask again, according to the Bible, are you supposed to judge or are you supposed to not judge? Well, I would say this. I think you're supposed to judge, but the definition of judgment is something we get more clarification and tightening on from Jesus in passages like Matthew chapter 7. It would seem, further, that the scope of that judgment does not include condemning people to hell or eternal judgment from God. That is the purview of God. He's real good at that. And from where we stand right now in our current station, we're just not qualified to participate in that at all. And that's a huge relief for me. I would hate to have that kind of pressure. I'm sure my judgments would be wrong. I'm sure God's judgments will all be right. May he be merciful to me, you, everyone, my enemies. May God's mercy abound as far as God sees fit for that mercy to abound. But sometimes there's injustice in the world, real problems, real screwed up stuff that demands justice. And the Bible makes it really clear that there's not a dang thing wrong with asking God for that justice. And maybe at some point, you, the prayer, would be the instrument of that justice. But generally, it seems like you outsource that to God. Vengeance is his. And you might not get the answer to the prayer that you want. Your enemies might thrive and prosper. We see that in the Bible. I mean, the rain falls on the righteous and the wicked, after all. But in outsourcing his own vindication in the situation to God by handing that off to God and saying, you're the owner of this thing. I don't need to solve this for my own sake right now. I don't need that vindication right now. In doing that, Nehemiah has profoundly lightened the load of what he's trying to accomplish here. Now he doesn't have to carry around that burden anymore. He gave it to God. He's got a wall to build. And tomorrow, the next day, we're going to move out of this prayer and back into the building montage to see how much progress we've made and how seriously we need to take the resistance that is still out there. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.